As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows over the desolate highway, Jake and Lisa's excitement for their cross-country road trip was palpable. Their destination was a secluded cabin in the Appalachian Mountains, a perfect escape from their stressful urban lives. Little did they know, the road ahead held secrets darker than the night that was quickly enveloping them. Their journey had been smooth until they reached an unmarked junction. The GPS insisted they take the narrow, winding road veering off the main highway, promising it was a shortcut. Reluctantly, Jake turned the car onto the eerily deserted path. The dense forest loomed on either side, closing in as the road narrowed further. Miles slipped by, and the couple noticed the road signs had vanished. The once charming forest now felt like a suffocating labyrinth. Panic began to set in as their car's headlights pierced through the thick fog that had rolled in. Lisa clutched her phone, desperately trying to find a signal. "Jake, we need to turn back. This doesn't feel right," Lisa urged, her voice trembling. Before Jake could respond, a figure darted across the road. He slammed on the brakes, heart pounding. They stared into the woods, where the figure had disappeared, but saw nothing. Jake resumed driving, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. Minutes later, the car sputtered and died. The couple was plunged into silence, the only sound their shallow breathing. They were stranded in the middle of nowhere, with no cell service and a dead car. Jake grabbed a flashlight from the glove compartment. "I'll check the engine." "Stay here," he said, trying to sound confident. As Jake inspected the engine, Lisa scanned the forest. Her flashlight beam caught something shiny in the underbrush. Curiosity overpowered her fear, and she stepped out of the car to investigate. She found a rusted sign partially covered in moss. Brushing it off, she read "Welcome to Carter's Mill, established 1862. A chill ran down her spine. The name sounded familiar. She remembered reading about a ghost town named Carter's Mill, abandoned in the 1940s after a series of mysterious deaths. The town was rumored to be cursed, and those who entered never returned. Jake's voice snapped her out of her thoughts. "Lisa, the engine's fine. It's like something's preventing it from starting." Suddenly they heard footsteps behind them. They turned to see a man dressed in old-fashioned clothes, his eyes hollow and devoid of life. "Can I help you folks?" he asked, his voice an eerie echo. "We're lost. Can you help us get back to the main road?" Jake asked, trying to hide his unease. The man smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Sure, follow me." With no other options, they followed the man into the woods. The path he led them down was overgrown and twisted. The fog thickened, making it hard to see. The forest seemed to whisper around them, ancient secrets carried on the wind. After what felt like hours, they reached a clearing. In the center stood an old mill, its silhouette ominous against the moonlight. The man turned to face them, his expression now sinister. "Welcome to Carter's Mill," he said, his voice now a menacing growl. "You'll never leave." Before they could react, the ground beneath them gave way, and they plunged into darkness. They landed in a damp, underground chamber. The walls were lined with old, decaying bones and tattered clothes. The air was thick with the stench of death. Lisa screamed as skeletal hands emerged from the walls, reaching for them. Jake grabbed her, pulling her towards the only visible exit. They ran through the labyrinthine tunnels, the ghosts of the past chasing them, their wails echoing in their ears. Finally, they emerged from the underground horror and found themselves back at their car. The engine roared to life as soon as Jake turned the key. They sped down the road, never looking back. the sinister whispers of Carter's Mill fading into the distance. That years later, they still couldn't explain what had happened that night. The shortcut had vanished from maps, and no one they spoke to had ever heard of Carter's Mill. The memory of the haunted highway lingered, a dark reminder of the dangers that lurk in the forgotten corners of the world. Tom, Sarah, and their dog Max set out for a weekend camping trip in the deep woods of Oregon. The secluded campsite promised tranquility and a break from the hectic pace of their lives. They were experienced campers and had prepared meticulously for the adventure. The drive to the campsite was uneventful, the dense pine forest closing in as they left the main road behind. The scent of pine needles and the sound of birds filled the air, providing a serene backdrop for their journey. But they reached their destination by late afternoon, set up camp, and built a fire as the sun dipped below the treetops. As night fell, the forest around them became a shadowy maze. The fire's glow offered a small circle of comfort in the vast darkness. They shared stories and laughed, feeling the stresses of everyday life melt away. Their laughter was interrupted by a low growl from Max. The dog stood at the edge of the firelight, hackles raised, staring into the forest. "What's wrong, boy?" Tom asked, trying to soothe the dog. Max's growl deepened, his eyes fixed on something unseen. Sarah shivered, glancing around. "Maybe it's just an animal. Let's go to bed. It's been a long day." Reluctantly, they retired to their tent, Max lying between them, still on alert. The forest outside was eerily silent, amplifying their unease. In the dead of night, Sarah awoke to a faint whispering. She sat up, straining to listen. The whispers seemed to come from the trees, a language she couldn't understand. Tom stirred beside her. "Do you hear that?" she whispered. Tom nodded, eyes wide with fear. "We need to get out of here." They grabbed their essentials, trying not to make a sound. Max followed them, ears perked. As they stepped out of the tent, the whispering grew louder, more urgent. The trees seemed to sway menacingly, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. They hurried through the dark forest, the whispering voices guiding them. Sarah's flashlight flickered and died, plunging them into darkness. Panic surged through her, but she forced herself to stay calm. Tom took the lead, using his phone's light to navigate. The whispers followed them, growing louder with each step. They could feel unseen eyes watching them, the forest alive with malevolent intent. After what felt like an eternity, they reached their car. They piled in, and Tom floored the accelerator. The headlights cut through the darkness, revealing fleeting glimpses of shadowy figures between the trees. They didn't stop until they were miles away from the forest, the whispering finally fading into silence. They pulled over at a rest stop, trying to catch their breath. "What was that?" Sarah asked, her voice shaking. Tom shook his head, unable to find an answer. Max whimpered, curling up on the back seat. They decided to head home, abandoning their camping trip. Weeks later, they still couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The forest seemed to have imprinted on them a haunting presence that lingered in their minds. A year later, Tom stumbled upon an old newspaper article about the area they had camped in. It spoke of a group of settlers who had vanished without a trace in the 1800s. Their disappearance was attributed to a curse placed by the local Native American tribe, angered by the settlers' disregard for the sacred land. The article mentioned the same whispering voices, guiding the settlers to their doom. Tom and Sarah realized they had narrowly escaped the same fate. The deep woods held secrets and spirits that were best left undisturbed. Late one night, Alex and Beth were driving through the vast, empty plains of Kansas. Their destination was a friend's wedding in Colorado, and they had decided to drive straight through the night to save time. The endless stretch of highway was monotonous, and the darkness outside seemed impenetrable. Around midnight, they started feeling the effects of fatigue. Alex, who was driving, noticed a flickering neon sign in the distance, a rest stop. Relieved, they pulled in to stretch their legs and grab some coffee. The rest stop was old and decrepit, with peeling paint and cracked windows. It seemed abandoned, but the neon sign flashed open insistently. They parked and approached the building, the gravel crunching under their feet. Inside, the rest stop was dimly lit and filled with dusty shelves. An old man stood behind the counter, his eyes shadowed and his expression unreadable. He greeted them with a nod. "Coffee?" Alex asked, his voice echoing in the stillness. The old man nodded, motioning towards an ancient coffee machine in the corner. Alex filled 2 cups, the strong aroma somewhat reassuring. Beth wandered around, her curiosity piqued by the strange assortment of items on the shelves. But she picked up a faded photograph of a family standing in front of the very rest stop they were in. The date on the back read 1965. As she put it down, she noticed more photos, all showing different families but in the same setting, spanning decades. "Alex, look at this," she called. Alex joined her, glancing at the photos. Weird. Maybe this place was more popular back in the day. They finished their coffee and thanked the old man, who still hadn't spoken. As they headed back to their car, Alex glanced back. The old man was watching them, his eyes glinting in the dim light. Back on the highway, Alex felt a growing unease. The rest stop had been too eerie, too out of place. Beth dozed off, but he couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. An hour later, the car started to sputter. Alex cursed as he pulled over to the side of the road. They were in the middle of nowhere, with no other cars in sight. He tried to restart the car, but it was dead. Beth woke up, groggy and confused. "What's happening?" "I don't know. The car just died," Alex replied, frustration evident in his voice. They sat in the dark, trying to figure out what to do. Suddenly, headlights appeared in the rearview mirror. A truck was approaching, its engine growling as it came to a stop behind them. A tall, burly man stepped out, his face obscured by the shadows. "Need some help?" he called. Relieved, Alex explained their situation. The man nodded and offered to give them a lift to the nearest town. Desperate, they agreed, climbing into the truck. As they drove, the man's silence became oppressive. Alex tried to make small talk, but the man only responded with grunts. The road seemed endless, the landscape blurring into an unrecognizable expanse. Finally, they reached a small town. The man dropped them off at a gas station, then drove away without a word. Alex and Beth thanked him, though he was already gone. The gas station attendant looked surprised to see them. "Where'd you come from? We don't get many visitors this time of night." Alex explained their situation, and the attendant offered to tow their car into town. They gratefully accepted and waited as the attendant made a call. As they sat in the small waiting area, Beth noticed a bulletin board filled with missing person flyers. Her heart sank as she recognized some of the faces from the photos at the rest stop. She nudged Alex, pointing at the board. "Look, Alex, those people, they were at the rest stop." Alex's blood ran cold. The realization hit them like a punch. The rest stop wasn't just eerie, it was a trap. They had narrowly escaped whatever fate had befallen the others. The tow truck arrived, and they retrieved their car. The attendant wished them well, his concern evident. They drove away, vowing never to take the safety of the open road for granted again. Summer vacation meant adventure for college friends Mike, Jess, Ben, and Laura. They planned a road trip to explore some off-the-beaten-path destinations, eager for new experiences. Their route took them through the dense forests of the Pacific Northwest, where they aimed to camp by a pristine, remote lake. The drive was long but filled with laughter and excitement. They followed a winding road deeper into the woods, relying on an old map Mike had found online. The promise of untouched nature was too enticing to resist. They arrived at Hollow Creek Lake by late afternoon. The scenery was breathtaking, with the setting sun casting golden hues over the crystal-clear water. They set up camp, cooked dinner, and shared stories around the campfire as the stars began to twinkle overhead. As the night grew darker, the forest around them seemed to come alive with strange sounds, the rustling of leaves, the distant hoot of an owl, and an occasional splash from the lake. Jess suggested a night swim, and despite some hesitation, they all agreed. The water was cool and refreshing. They swam and played, their laughter echoing across the lake. But their fun was cut short when Ben felt something brush against his leg. He dismissed it as a fish, but the unease lingered. Back at the campsite, they changed into dry clothes and settled around the fire again. Laura told a story she had heard about the area, a tale of a woman named Eleanor who had drowned in the lake a century ago. Legend had it that her spirit still haunted the waters, seeking revenge on those who disturbed her peace. As Laura spoke, the fire suddenly flickered and died, plunging them into darkness. Mike grabbed a flashlight and tried to reignite the flames, but the firewood refused to catch. "That's weird," he muttered. "It was fine a minute ago." A cold breeze swept through the campsite, and the air felt charged with electricity. Jess shivered, pulling her jacket tighter around her. Maybe we should call it a night. They retreated to their tents, but sleep was elusive. The forest outside seemed to pulse with an unseen presence. Jess tossed and turned, haunted by Laura's story. In the middle of the night, Jess awoke to a soft, mournful singing. She sat up, straining to listen. The voice was ethereal, drifting across the lake. She unzipped the tent and stepped outside, the hair on her arms standing on end. "Jess, what are you doing?" Mike whispered, waking up beside her. "Do you hear that?" she replied. Mike listened, his eyes widening. "It's coming from the lake." They woke Ben and Laura, and the four of them cautiously approached the water's edge. The singing grew louder, more plaintive. The lake's surface shimmered under the moonlight, and a faint figure could be seen standing in the shallows. "Is that?" Eleanor Laura whispered, fear gripping her. The figure turned towards them, and the friends saw the spectral form of a woman, her eyes filled with sorrow and anger. She raised her hand, beckoning them closer. "Run," Mike shouted, grabbing Jess's hand. They sprinted back to the campsite, but their tent had been torn apart, their belongings scattered. Panic set in as they realized they were truly alone in the haunted forest. They grabbed what they could and fled towards their car. The singing followed them, growing louder and more frantic. They could feel Eleanor's presence closing in, her fury palpable. When they reached the car, they piled in, and Mike fumbled with the keys. The engine roared to life, and they sped down the narrow road, the haunting melody fading into the distance. They didn't stop until they reached the nearest town. Exhausted and shaken, they found a motel and collapsed into bed, unable to shake the image of Eleanor's ghostly form. The next morning, they decided to cut their trip short and return home. The haunting of Hollow Creek Lake had left them scarred, a chilling reminder of the unseen horrors that lurk in the deep woods. They later learned that several others had experienced similar encounters at the lake, but no one had ever captured evidence of Eleanor's ghost. The legend persisted, a warning to those who dared to disturb the waters of Hollow Creek. The experience at Hollow Creek Lake changed them all. They returned to their college lives, but the shadow of that night followed them. Each of them tried to bury the memories, yet the haunting image of Eleanor's ghostly figure lingered. 6 months later. It was winter break, and the group decided to reunite for a weekend at Mike's family cabin in the mountains. They hoped the familiarity of the cabin and the cheerful holiday atmosphere would help them move past their shared trauma. The first night at the cabin, they gathered around the fireplace, the warmth and crackling fire providing a sense of comfort. Mike made hot cocoa, and they tried to distract themselves with board games and holiday movies. For a while it worked, they laughed and enjoyed each other's company. But as the night grew darker and the wind howled outside, memories of Hollow Creek Lake crept back into their minds. The conversation inevitably turned to that night. "I still hear her sometimes," Jess admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "When it's quiet and I'm trying to sleep, I hear her singing." Laura nodded, her eyes reflecting the firelight. "Me too. It's like she's still out there waiting." Mike stared into the flames. "I've had nightmares. She always reaches out for me and I can't move. I wake up drenched in sweat and the feeling doesn't go away." But Ben, who had been silent, finally spoke up. "We need to do something about it. We can't keep living like this. Maybe we need to go back." "Are you crazy?" Jess exclaimed. "Go back there? Why?" To confront her, Ben replied, his voice firm, "To put an end to this once and for all. Maybe if we acknowledge her, try to understand her pain, we can find some peace." And the idea hung in the air, heavy and daunting. None of them wanted to return to Hollow Creek, but they all understood that the haunting had deeply affected them. They needed closure. The return to Hollow Creek Lake. Spring break arrived, and the four friends found themselves driving back to Hollow Creek Lake. The journey was somber, each of them lost in their thoughts. They arrived in the late afternoon, the forest lush and green, a stark contrast to the wintry desolation they had left behind at the cabin. They set up camp near the lake, the familiarity of the place sending shivers down their spines. The sun began to set, and they prepared for the night ahead. "We have to stay calm and show respect," Laura said, her voice steady. "If she appears, we need to let her know we're here to help." As darkness enveloped the forest, they gathered by the water's edge, holding hands for reassurance. The lake was eerily still, the surface reflecting the full moon above. Hours passed in tense silence. Then, just as they were beginning to doubt their decision, the mournful singing began. The air grew cold, and the figure of Eleanor emerged from the water, her ghostly form shimmering in the moonlight. "We're here to help you," Jess called out, her voice trembling. "We want to understand your pain." Eleanor's eyes, fixed on them, filled with sorrow and anger. She raised her hand, but instead of beckoning them closer, she pointed to a spot near the shore. They saw a faint glow, revealing an old, weathered locket half buried in the sand. Ben stepped forward, picked up the locket, and opened it. Inside was a small, faded photograph of a man and a woman, both smiling. The resemblance to Eleanor was unmistakable. "It's her," Ben said. "This must be why she's still here. She lost something precious." Tears streamed down Jess's face. "Eleanor, We found your locket. We're sorry for disturbing you. We hope you can find peace now." Eleanor's form wavered, her eyes softening as she looked at the locket. She nodded slowly, a look of gratitude replacing the anger. As she faded away, the air warmed and the oppressive feeling lifted. Aftermath. The haunting presence of Eleanor was gone. The friends felt an immense sense of relief and closure. They stayed at the lake for a few more days, enjoying the peaceful surroundings without the fear that had gripped them before. When they finally left Hollow Creek Lake, they felt lighter, as if a great weight had been lifted from their shoulders. They returned to their lives, no longer haunted by the ghostly singing or the image of Eleanor. The experience had changed them, deepening their bond and their appreciation for life. They had faced their fears and helped a tormented spirit find peace, and in doing so, they had found peace themselves. Eleanor's story remained with them, a reminder of the fragile line between the living and the dead, and the importance of compassion and understanding. The haunting of Hollow Creek Lake became a tale they shared with others, a testament to the power of confronting the past and seeking closure.